Elias Vaughn trudged through the blinding snowstorm, his boots crunching against the icy ground of glacier. The wind howled like a restless ghost, and the temperature was cold enough to freeze a man's breath midair. Elias pulled his thick coat tighter around his shoulders and squinted at the horizon. The endless expanse of white stretched as far as his eyes could see, broken only by the faint silhouette of his small outpost in the distance. Life on Glacier was harsh, but Elias preferred the solitude. He was a prospector by trade, searching the frozen wasteland for rare minerals buried beneath layers of ice. His only companions were the hum of his machines and the occasional signal from the nearby settlement, a place he rarely visited. As he reached the ridge overlooking his outpost, something caught his eye. A figure lay motionless in the snow, half buried by the storm. His heart skipped a beat. No one wandered this far from the settlements. He hesitated, instincts screaming caution, but curiosity got the better of him. Drawing his plasma torch for safety, Elias approached the figure. It was a woman, or at least something that resembled one. Her skin was an ethereal shade of blue, shimmering faintly in the dim light. Long, silvery hair fanned out around her, glinting like strands of ice. She wore a tattered, unfamiliar suit that seemed too advanced to belong to any human Elias had ever met. "Help, please." The woman's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed strangely, as if carried on the wind. Her eyes flickered open, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Elias knelt beside her, unsure what to do. What are you?" he asked, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. "Shelter," she rasped, her words halting. "I need shelter. I can't survive." He looked at her again, his mind racing. She wasn't human. There was no doubt about that. Every instinct told him to walk away, to leave this strange creature to her fate. But something in her voice, a desperate vulnerability, tugged at him. "You'll die out here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. After a moment's hesitation, he slid his arms beneath her frail body and lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, almost unnaturally so. The journey back to his outpost was grueling. The storm fought him with every step, and the woman in his arms shivered violently despite his best efforts to shield her from the wind. By the time he reached the small metal structure, his muscles ached and his fingers were numbed from the cold. Inside, the warmth of the heater washed over him. Elias placed the woman gently on a cot, wrapping her in thick blankets. She clung to them weakly, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she whispered before her eyelids fluttered closed. Elias stared at her for a long moment, unsure of what he had just brought into his home. One thing was certain. His quiet, solitary life on Glacier was about to change forever. The storm outside howled relentlessly, shaking the walls of the outpost. Elias sat by the small heater, his gaze flicking between the alien woman and the snow-covered window. The faint hum of the heating unit was the only other sound, filling the room with an eerie quiet. The woman stirred, her pale blue fingers clutching the blanket tighter. Her glowing eyes opened slowly, scanning her surroundings with a mix of confusion and fear. "You're awake," Elias said, his voice low and calm. He leaned forward, keeping a cautious distance. "How are you feeling?" She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze settled on him, and for a moment, the tension in the air thickened. Then she spoke, her voice soft but resonant. "Warmer. Thank you for saving me." Elias shrugged, trying to mask his unease. "You were freezing to death out there. What were you doing in the middle of nowhere?" "No one comes this far." Her eyes flickered with hesitation, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Liveth. I am not from this world. My ship crashed not far from here. I was fleeing. Elias raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "From who?" Liveth hesitated, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "A powerful force. They hunt me because of what I know, what I can do. If they find me, it will not end well." Elias frowned, What exactly do you know? Why are they after you? She sat up slightly, wincing as she adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. I was a scientist. My work was revolutionary, a way to create energy that is clean, limitless. But those who control the stars, those in power, they do not want such change. It threatens them. Her words hung in the air, and Elias stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. An alien scientist on the run from some galactic elite. It sounded like something out of a cheap holofilm. I don't know what you expect me to do, he said cautiously. I'm just a prospector. I dig for minerals and barely make enough to survive. I don't have the resources to fight off whatever's after you. I don't ask for you to fight, Liveth said quickly, her voice urgent. Only shelter. If they think I am dead, they may stop searching. You saved me. That makes you part of this now, whether you like it or not. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. She wasn't wrong. If whoever was hunting her tracked her to his outpost, his life would be in danger too. I'll give you shelter, he said finally, his tone firm. But if things get too dangerous, I'm not risking my neck for you. Understand? Liveth nodded solemnly. I understand. Thank you, Elias Vaughn. Her use of his full name startled him, but he didn't press her on how she knew it. As the storm raged on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something far bigger than himself. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world covered in shimmering snow under a pale blue sky. Elias stepped outside to check the solar panels, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The quiet of Glacia's wilderness was both a comfort and a warning, a reminder of how alone he truly was. But today, the silence felt heavier. Inside the outpost, Liveth was awake and moving about cautiously. She examined Elias's equipment, her long blue fingers grazing over wires and metal panels with an almost reverent curiosity. Her presence was unsettling, but also oddly fascinating. She seemed so fragile, yet carried an air of wisdom and power that made Elias uneasy. Elias stepped back inside, stomping snow off his boots. If you're going to tinker with my stuff, at least don't break anything, he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. Liveth looked at him, her glowing eyes soft. Your technology is primitive, but clever. It reminds me of my people before we ventured into the stars. Elias frowned but chose not to respond. Instead, he busied himself with a panel near the heater, pretending not to care. That was when the silence broke. A sharp, high-pitched sound pierced the air, followed by a crackling transmission from the comm unit on the wall. This is the Imperial Recovery Unit. The fugitive Liveth has been spotted in your sector. She is dangerous and must be handed over immediately. Non-compliance will result in severe consequences. Elias froze, his stomach dropping. He turned to Liveth, who stood rigid, her face pale even against her blue skin. Who are these people? He asked, his voice low. Not people, Liveth said, her tone trembling with urgency. They are enforcers of the elite. They will destroy everything to find me. Elias's fists clenched. Great. So now I'm on their radar because I saved your life. I warned you, Liveth said softly, guilt flashing in her eyes. I didn't want this, but it was inevitable once you helped me. I will leave. No, you won't. Elias cut her off, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. If you step out there, you'll die. And if these enforcers think I'm hiding you, I'm dead too. So we deal with this together. Liveth blinked, caught off guard by his determination. The comm crackled again, louder this time. We are locking onto your coordinates. Surrender the fugitive, or prepare to be neutralized. Elias grabbed his plasma torch, his mind racing. Do you have any tricks up your sleeve, or am I fighting off these guys with my bare hands? Liveth hesitated, then reached into a compartment on her suit, pulling out a small glowing device. This may help. It disrupts their scanners temporarily. But we must move quickly to prepare. Elias nodded, adrenaline surging through him. As the sound of engines grew louder outside, signaling the arrival of their pursuers, he realized that his quiet, isolated life on Glacia had officially come to an end. The hum of engines echoed across the frozen expanse, growing louder with each passing moment. Elias peeked through a narrow slit in the window, spotting two sleek, black crafts descending from the sky. Their design was nothing like any Earth technology he had ever seen, sleek, ominous, and bristling with weapons. Inside the outpost, Liveth worked quickly, her fingers deftly adjusting the small glowing device she had retrieved earlier. The energy it emitted pulsated faintly, sending waves of light across the walls. Elias couldn't take his eyes off it. "What is that thing?" he asked, his voice sharp with curiosity and frustration. "And don't give me a vague answer this time." Liveth glanced up, her expression unreadable. "It's a signal disruptor. It scrambles their tracking systems, buys us time." Elias folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "Time for what exactly? To run? To hide? You need to start telling me the truth, Liveth. What are we really up against?" She paused, her glowing eyes meeting his. For the first time, there was no hesitation. "You deserve to know." Taking a deep breath, she began. "My people, the Elysians, are an advanced race spread across many systems. We once thrived on innovation, creating technologies to better our lives and the lives of others. But over time, greed corrupted the leaders. They formed alliances with intergalactic elites, those who profit from war, scarcity, and control." Elias listened intently, the pieces of her story falling into place. "I was a scientist," Liveth continued. "My team developed a technology that could harness infinite energy from subatomic particles, clean, free, and available to all. But the elites, they saw it as a threat to their power. If energy became free, their systems of control would collapse." Elias frowned. "So, they came after you." She nodded. "They shut down my project, labeled me a criminal, and sent their enforcers to destroy everything and everyone connected to my work. I barely escaped with my life." Elias let out a low whistle, pacing the room. "And now they're here because they think you might rebuild it." "Not think," Liveth corrected. "No. The device I carry contains the blueprint for the energy system. It's the only copy left. If it falls into their hands, they'll destroy it. And me." Elias stopped pacing, staring at her. "You're telling me you have the power to change the universe, and it's sitting in my outpost?" "Yes." The weight of her words sank into him like a lead anchor. For a moment, he considered what it meant, not just for her, but for humanity. If her technology worked, it could revolutionize Earth, breaking the grip of megacorporations that had bled the planet dry. Before he could respond, the sound of heavy boots crunching through the snow reached his ears. "They're here," Liveth said, her voice steady but tense. Elias grabbed his plasma torch and looked at her. "Then let's make sure they regret coming." Liveth gave a faint smile, her fingers tightening around the disruptor. "Agreed." Outside, the enforcers closed in, unaware that inside the small outpost, human ingenuity and alien resilience were about to collide. The air inside the outpost buzzed with tension. Elias crouched near the window, peering through a crack as the enforcers approached. There were 3 of them, clad in sleek, black armor that shimmered faintly in the pale light. Their movements were precise, calculated, like predators closing in on prey. "They'll storm this place any second," Elias muttered, gripping his plasma torch tightly. "What's the plan, genius?" Liveth stood by the table, her glowing device humming softly in her hands. Her expression was calm, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "We fight smart, not hard. Their strength is in their tech and coordination. But they don't know this terrain like you do, and they don't expect you to fight back." Elias raised an eyebrow. "You're putting a lot of faith in a prospector with a torch." Liveth gave a small smile. "Humans have a talent for defying the odds. Let's put that to use." She placed the disruptor on the table and activated it. A soft pulse of light rippled outward, and the hum of the enforcers' scanning equipment outside abruptly cut off. "That'll scramble their comms and targeting systems for a few minutes," Liveth explained. "But it won't last. We need to use this time wisely." Elias nodded, his mind racing. "I've got some old mining charges in the shed out back. If we can lure them there." Liveth's eyes lit up. An ambush. Perfect. Together, they worked quickly. Elias retrieved the charges, placing them strategically near the shed's entrance. Liveth rigged them to a remote trigger using parts scavenged from Elias's equipment. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension mounting as the enforcers drew closer. The first enforcer reached the door, his armored fist pounding against it. "Open up," a distorted voice barked. "Hand over the fugitive, and you might live." Elias smirked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Come and get her." The enforcers didn't wait for a second invitation. The door burst open, and they stormed in, weapons raised. But Liveth's disruptor was already working its magic. Their targeting systems faltered, causing their shots to veer wildly off course. Elias and Liveth slipped out through the back, snow crunching beneath their boots as they moved toward the shed. The enforcers quickly recovered and pursued, their movements unnervingly efficient despite the disruption. As the first enforcer entered the shed, Elias pressed the trigger. The mining charges detonated with a deafening boom, sending a plume of snow and debris into the air. One down. The remaining two enforcers were more cautious, splitting up to flank the outpost. Elias and Liveth worked in tandem, using the terrain to their advantage. Elias's knowledge of the land and Liveth's quick thinking allowed them to outmaneuver their attackers. In the end, the final enforcer fell, their black armor crumpled in the snow. Elias stood over the wreckage, breathing heavily. "You were right," he said, turning to Liveth. "Humans are good at defying the odds." Liveth smiled faintly. "This is only the beginning, Elias. The real fight is still ahead." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, he realized that they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something far greater. The wind howled across the icy plains of Glacia, but the cold wasn't what kept Elias awake. Inside the small outpost, he paced restlessly, his mind racing with thoughts of the enforcers and what lay ahead. The battle they had fought off earlier was just the beginning. He knew that once word got out about what had happened, more would come. Liveth sat at the table, her hands resting lightly on the disruptor device. Her eyes, though glowing faintly with their usual intensity, were clouded with worry. "We can't keep running forever," she said softly, breaking the silence. "They'll send reinforcements, and when they do, we won't be able to hide anymore." Elias paused in his pacing, his thoughts aligning with hers. "So, what? We make a stand here?" She nodded, her voice steady. "This place is isolated, but it's not invulnerable. If we can get the equipment working, we can make it a fortress. But we'll need to be ready for anything." Elias ran a hand through his hair, the weight of her words sinking in. His life had been quiet before she arrived. Simple, isolated. But now, with the enforcers bearing down on them, it was all-out war. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But he didn't have a choice. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Elias and Liveth worked side by side, using every tool and every scrap of technology at their disposal. Liveth's alien knowledge was invaluable, transforming Elias's outdated equipment into something far more advanced. They rigged traps, fortified doors, and hacked into the satellite systems, ensuring that no one could track their movements. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the outpost looked less like a prospector's home and more like a battleground. Elias stood back, surveying their work. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Do you think it'll hold?" Elias asked, looking over at Liveth. She glanced at the makeshift defenses, her face unreadable. "It will for a while." A distant rumble reached them, carried on the wind. Elias stiffened. It was low, mechanical. The sound of heavy engines. They were coming. "They're here," Liveth said, her voice tight. Elias looked out the window, spotting the silhouette of the lead enforcer ship breaking through the storm. It was larger than any of the crafts they had fought before, sleeker, more menacing. The rest of the enforcer fleet would be close behind. "We don't have much time," Elias muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to Liveth. "What now?" Liveth reached for the disruptor, her fingers dancing across the controls. "We hold them off as long as we can. You know the land better than I do. Lead them into the traps I've set. I'll disable their weapon systems." Elias nodded. His pulse quickened, but his mind was sharp. They had fought once before. This time, they would be ready. The sound of engines grew louder as the enforcers descended, their craft hovering just above the snowy ground. Elias gripped his plasma torch, Liveth standing beside him, her expression calm but focused. Outside, the first wave of soldiers stepped out of the ships, clad in black armor, their movements synchronized. "This is it," Elias muttered. "Time to make our stand." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the outpost, it was all too clear. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something much bigger, for freedom, for change, and for a future they could control. The wind howled outside, its icy fingers scratching at the walls of the outpost as the enforcers closed in. Elias stood by the window, his breath misting the glass. The heavy sound of their ships grew louder, signaling that their assault was imminent. His heart raced. It was time to act. He glanced at Liveth, who was seated at the control panel, her fingers flying over the buttons and switches, her eyes intense with concentration. The disruptor she had built from scraps of Elias's equipment hummed faintly in the corner, its power slowly charging. "Are you ready?" Elias asked, turning to her. She didn't look up. "Almost. We need to disable their communications first. If we can't stop them from calling for backup, we won't have a chance." Elias nodded. He had no idea how she was managing to stay so calm. To him, every second felt like an eternity. But then again, Liveth had seen war before. Her alien calm was a reminder that this wasn't her first battle. As the first enforcer ship landed outside, a low rumble shaking the ground, Elias couldn't help but wonder how many more would follow. How many enemies were there in the fleet, and how far would they go to capture Liveth? He shook his head. There was no time for questions. It was time to act. Liveth turned toward him, her face set with resolve. "We have a small window. Once their communications are cut off, we'll need to move quickly. I can send out a message to the nearby colony, but I can't guarantee they'll help." Elias's eyes widened. "A message? You mean to call for reinforcements?" "Yes," Liveth replied. "The people on the colony are not loyal to the enforcers. There are others who would stand with us, but only if they know what's really happening." Elias felt a surge of hope. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. "Do it." Liveth began typing quickly on the console, sending out a signal that would broadcast across the nearby systems. The message was simple. "Help. They are coming for us. They want to silence the truth. We must stand together." Elias watched, feeling the strange mix of fear and excitement. This could be their only chance to turn the tide. If the colony answered, if anyone came to their aid, they might just have a fighting chance. But as the message went out, Elias heard the sound of boots crunching in the snow outside. The enforcers had arrived. "Time's up," he muttered, his pulse quickening. "Let's move." Together, they grabbed their weapons. Elias's plasma torch hummed to life in his hand, and Liveth held the disruptor, ready to unleash its power. They moved quickly, slipping out the back of the outpost and into the snowstorm, blending into the whiteness that surrounded them. The enforcers were closing in, and Elias knew that this was the moment. If they could hold out just a little longer, they might have a chance. But if no one responded to Liveth's message, this might be the last fight they would ever have. As they moved into position, Elias glanced at Liveth, the woman from the stars who had brought so much chaos into his life. For a moment, he saw her not as an alien fugitive, but as a symbol of something bigger, something worth fighting for. "Whatever happens," Elias said, his voice steady despite the storm around them. "We've done what we could." Liveth nodded. "Now we fight for what's right." And with that, they stepped forward, ready to face the enforcers and whatever else the future held. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a living creature, but Elias couldn't focus on the cold. His eyes were fixed on the enforcer ships, their dark shapes looming on the horizon like predators circling their prey. The enforcers had been relentless, closing in on the small outpost with military precision, but Elias and Liveth had made sure to stay one step ahead. The plan was simple: create enough chaos to buy time for reinforcements. But Elias knew that time was running out. The small colony was hours away, and there was no guarantee that anyone would come in time. Liveth moved quickly, her alien tech flashing as she worked on the disruptor. The device had been their only hope so far, scrambling the enforcers' communication systems and slowing them down. But Elias could see the signs of wear. It was close to running out of power. They needed more time, but time was the one thing they didn't have. "Liveth," Elias called, glancing over his shoulder as he set up a series of traps near the entrance of the outpost. "How much longer before that thing gives out?" Liveth didn't answer at first. She was absorbed in her work, her long fingers moving swiftly across the panel of the disruptor. Finally, she looked up, her face taut with concentration. "The disruptor will last another 30 minutes at best. After that, they'll know exactly where we are." Elias cursed under his breath. 30 minutes. That wasn't nearly enough. He surveyed the area around him, his mind working quickly. They had to come up with something that would force the enforcers to retreat. Liveth had her technology, but it was limited, and Elias was only one man. "Wait," he muttered to himself, a thought sparking in his mind. "The geothermal vents." Liveth looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Elias's eyes widened with realization. "Glacier's geothermal vents. They're scattered all over the planet. If we can reroute the energy from one of them into the outpost systems, create a massive heat burst, we can force the enforcers to fall back." Liveth's eyes widened, and for the first time, she seemed unsure. "It's risky. The energy surge could overwhelm the system. We might lose everything." "I don't care about the outpost," Elias said firmly. "We can rebuild. But if we don't act now, we won't have a chance to fight back." Liveth hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "You're right. Let's do it." Together, they worked quickly, rerouting the power from the geothermal vent near the outpost. Liveth worked on the alien systems, tweaking them to control the power flow, while Elias kept a lookout for any signs of the enforcers closing in. The countdown in his mind ticked away, each passing second growing more precious. Finally, the systems were ready. Elias gave Liveth a final look. "When this goes off, we need to move. Fast." She nodded, her face tense but determined. "I'll activate it. Get ready." Elias braced himself as Liveth activated the device. The ground trembled beneath them as a surge of heat erupted from the vent, sending a shockwave through the air. For a brief moment, the entire outpost was bathed in a blinding light. Outside, the enforcers were thrown back by the heat blast, their ships veering off course as they scrambled to adjust their systems. Elias and Liveth exchanged a look. The breakthrough had worked. But as the heat wave subsided, they both knew it wasn't over. The enforcers would be back. And next time, they would be ready. The shockwave from the geothermal vent had sent the enforcers reeling, their ships scattering like leaves in the wind. For a moment, the silence that followed felt almost surreal, as if time itself had slowed down. Elias stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The energy surge had done more than just blind the enforcers. It had given them a fighting chance. Liveth was already moving, her eyes scanning the sky for any signs of the enforcers regrouping. "We have a few minutes," she said urgently, her voice sharp and focused. "They'll recover quickly. We need to use this time to prepare." Elias didn't need any more convincing. His pulse was racing, but his mind was clear now. They had one shot, and he wasn't about to waste it. "We'll set the final traps," he said, glancing around the outpost. "Then we get to the high ground. That'll give us a better view of their movements." Liveth nodded, her face calm despite the situation. Together, they moved swiftly, checking the remaining traps and setting up additional defensive measures. Every second counted. The sound of engines returned, but this time it was different. The enforcers were regrouping, but they were no longer scattered. They were moving in formation, a well-coordinated force ready to retake the outpost. Elias could see their ships hovering just above the horizon, their dark shapes growing larger by the second. "They're coming," Elias muttered, his fingers tightening around his plasma torch. "We need to make this count." Liveth's eyes narrowed, her alien intellect calculating their next move. "We won't beat them in open combat, but we don't have to. We'll draw them into the traps, then hit them hard." The first enforcer ship landed near the outpost with a heavy thud, followed by several more. Elias counted them quickly, at least 6. He had no idea how many more were hidden behind them, but they couldn't afford to wait and find out. "They're starting to spread out," Elias said, adjusting the scope on his plasma torch. "It's now or never." Liveth's fingers danced across a control panel, activating the disruptor one last time. The enforcers' communication systems flickered, cutting off their ability to call for backup. It was their final advantage. Elias knew they had only one chance to take down the enforcers before they could regroup. The first wave of soldiers moved in, their weapons aimed at the outpost's door. Elias watched, his breath steady, his hands steady. He had spent years surviving on this cold, unforgiving planet. Now he was going to use everything he had learned to fight back. As the enforcers advanced, Elias triggered the first of the traps. Explosions rocked the ground, sending snow and debris flying into the air. The enforcers were thrown off balance, their movements chaotic as they tried to regain their footing. Liveth took the opportunity, using her alien technology to disable their weapon systems. The enforcers were vulnerable, their guns useless against her tech. Elias and Liveth moved with precision, taking out one enforcer after another. But just as they thought they had gained the upper hand, a new ship appeared on the horizon, a massive transport ship, far larger than anything they had seen before. It landed with a low, ominous hum, its doors opening to reveal an entire battalion of enforcers. "We're not done yet," Elias muttered under his breath. "But we'll keep fighting. We won't let them win." Liveth nodded, her face set in determination. "We fight together." And with that, they prepared for the next wave, knowing that no matter what happened, they had already made their stand. The battle wasn't over, but they weren't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The transport ship loomed above them, its engines roaring as it hovered just above the snow. Elias felt the ground shake with each passing second, his heart hammering in his chest. There were more enforcers now, too many to count. But he wasn't about to give up. Not when they had come this far. Liveth stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the incoming battalion. The disruptor was down to its last charge, but her determination burned brighter than ever. "We can't stop here," she said, her voice steadied despite the overwhelming odds. "We have one last chance." Elias nodded, gripping his plasma torch tightly. "We've come too far to turn back." The battalion of enforcers began to spread out, their heavy boots crunching in the snow as they advanced toward the outpost. Elias could see their faces now, cold, determined. They were professionals, trained for this, but they weren't ready for what came next. Liveth raised her hand, signaling to Elias. He activated the final trap, a series of high-tech mines buried in the snow. The first enforcer stepped forward, unaware of the danger. Suddenly, the ground erupted beneath them. Explosions rippled outward, sending snow and debris into the air. Chaos broke out as the enforcers scrambled to regain control. The minefields had done their job, taking down a few, disorienting the rest. Elias didn't hesitate. He charged forward, plasma torch blazing, cutting through the disarray. Liveth followed close behind, using her alien tech to disable weapons and scramble the enforcers' communications. They were fighting on their terms now. The once unbeatable enforcers were falling one by one, unable to regroup. But even as they fought, Elias knew the battle was far from over. The massive transport ship still hovered above them, and its crew was about to join the fight. "Liveth," Elias shouted, his voice urgent. "We need to take down that ship." Liveth's eyes narrowed. "I can disrupt its systems, but only for a few minutes. You'll need to be quick." Elias gave a sharp nod. "I'll handle it. You keep them off me." With no time to waste, Elias sprinted toward the ship, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he charged through the snow. The ship's turrets began to swivel, aiming directly at him. But before they could fire, Liveth activated the disruptor one last time. The ship's systems flickered, and the turrets froze in place. Elias took his shot. He aimed his plasma torch at the vulnerable underside of the ship, melting through the plating until he reached the power core. With one final surge, the ship's engines sputtered and died, the massive craft falling to the ground with a thunderous crash. The enforcers on board were thrown from their feet, unable to regain control. Elias turned to Liveth, breathless but triumphant. "It's done." Liveth walked over, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We did it." But their victory was short-lived. Elias knew that the battle was just one step in a much larger fight. As the enforcers retreated, regrouping for another assault, Liveth turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and resolve. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. "There are others out there, like me, who will fight for change. We can't stop now." Elias nodded, understanding what she meant. The fight for freedom, for a new future, had only just begun. But together, they had already proven that no enemy was too great, no force too powerful. "We won't stop," Elias said firmly, his voice resolute. "We'll keep fighting. For us. For everyone." And as the last of the enforcers retreated into the distance, they knew that they had changed the course of history. The promise had been fulfilled. Now, it was time to build the future they have fought for.